That's Nick.
And that's Joseph. And today we're here to talk about Monstrous. I think it's the 8th film, directed by Chris Sivertson.
Oh, wow.
Being released courtesy of Screen Media on May 13th, 2022. It originally premiered at the Glasgow Film Festival. You might know Chris Sivertson for directing probably one of the worst reviewed films of the 2000s with I Know Who Killed Me, starring Lindsay Lohan in 2007. He also has co-directed a film called All Cheerleaders Die. There are actually two...
That is true.
Well, eventually they all dust to dust, huh? But that was his debut. He co-directed with Lucky McKee, and they remade that film in 2013.
Why does Lucky McKee sound familiar?
Because I like Lucky McKee a lot, who directed May.
Oh.
And also The Woman, which I think we reviewed the Blu-ray of The Woman.
And there's a sequel.
There is, directed by Pollyanna McIntosh, which he did not direct. Anyhow, this I think we were interested in watching for a combination of seeing what Mr. Sivertson's been up to, and it stars Christina Ricci.
Okay, the basic story, there's a big spoiler. So
You're going to start with that?
No, but and if you don't want to know it, then turn the shit off. Okay, Christina Ricci plays a woman named Laura. Mm-hmm. Okay, it's the 1950s. Laura has absconded with her 9-10-year-old son Cody to get away from her abusive husband. So we see that she has rented someone's guest house, and she's trying to set up a new life far away from his ass.
It's a very large house.
It's actually a very large, nice house, which is like someone's guest house. That didn't quite make sense to me. This house is also right next to a lake, which is important.
Notably, that is Altadina's Woodbury Story House. That's an infamous house that's been featured in American Horror Story, VHS, and True Blood.
So Cody is having a hard time because he wants to go back home. He wants to be with his dad and his friends, but that's not going to happen. So Cody starts to see or say that there's a monster outside of his window. And we see it. We see that in the lake there's some creature that comes out at night. And very quickly he's like, oh, the pretty lady is my friend. Mm-hmm. But to the audience, it's well, it looks like a monster. Like an old skeleton witch. But everything culminates because Laura's having trouble. She takes a job and she's been drinking. She gets fired. She is also experiencing weird things related to the witch, ghost, pretty lady, swamp monster. So she's having, there's contention between her and the landlords. But everything culminates with Laura is visiting Cody's school to pick him up, and a teacher comes out and tells her what are you doing here? Well, my son. And she's like, hold on, I got something for your ass. And then we cut to Lori, what's her name?
Laura.
Christina Ricci. We see her in a police interrogation room. Mm-hmm. And that teacher is actually a social worker. And she's like, so talk to me about what's going on in your son, blah, blah, blah. And then we find out her son is actually dead. But before we find that out, it's the 1950s, right? And they're talking in this interrogation room. And all of a sudden, Christina Ricci's cell phone rings. So she walks out of the interrogation room. They just let her ass leave.
No, she asks for water and dips out.
Well, yeah. So she just walks out. And we see her in LA. It looks like she's in LA, just in modern time in the streets. Okay. So her son's not really dead. Everything that we saw as the audience is her in her mind, thinking that it's the 1950s. Clearly, she was affected by the death of her son, who died in a swimming accident, and she has created this alternate reality. But it's present time, so where the hell did the 1950s come from? We find out that she's also she has trauma related to the death of her grandmother, who was popping back in the 50s, I guess. And of course, there's no monster, even though we saw one.
The pretty lady is the grandmother from 1959.
But we can get into it, but the monster represents Laura accepting the death of her, not only her son, but her grandmother. But to the audience, we see a monster, but the little boy keeps saying the pretty lady, because really, it's like those two trying to reconnect. Like the grandma and the dead son are like where they need to be. Anyway, that's it.
Yeah, that's it. She's
She was imagining it all.
It starts with her and her imaginary son driving from Arizona to California, and returns. It ends with her just driving back to Mesa, Arizona, in her grandmother's 1959, whatever kind of car that is.
Some sort of Chevy, yeah. Where to begin? Could I just go through my notes? Mm-hmm. Christina Ricci, she's the best part of the movie.
Yes.
I think she gives. I didn't care for this movie, and we can talk about why. I think we share the same feelings. It just feels too layered, and it's not executed well enough to compensate for kind of how ridiculous it is. It ends up being.
Yeah, it's not sophisticated enough to navigate what it's doing.
Right.
It's been a minute since I've seen her as the lead in a film. Obviously, she was in Yellow Jackets, which is a big hit. She has a very brief role in The Matrix Resurrections.
Oh, I didn't know that.
It's in one scene. I've always, maybe it's a nostalgia factor because as a kid I grew up watching her Now and Then and Casper, and of course The Ice Storm opposite Sigourney Weaver.
And the Addams Family.
And yes, so many things. And there's a new Wednesday. I think I get the sense there's going to be kind of a resurgence for Christina Ricci, hopefully.
She looks great. She looks great on screen.
She does elevate this material.
Yeah. And I appreciate that she was giving a lot. Like, there are moments where I think this film does transcend sort of the mediocre feel of it because of her. But anyway, I was going to say that she is obviously stressed out in this reality she's created for herself, which is funny to me. And she has this little, like, jewelry box filled with...
a shoebox, I think.
Or a little shoebox filled with liquor, vodka, and...
Travel-sized vodka.
Travel-sized vodka and cigarettes. I thought that was cute.
That represents her because we're getting clues about her kind of ravaged psyche, if you will. That somebody keeps calling the phone in the house, and it's her husband who's somehow gotten that number, which they try to explain by like a friend gave it to him. And she's talking to her doctor, who is reality is her doctor, and she's like, should I get back on medication? And then she goes off the rails so quickly with the liquor and cigarettes, and she...
Well, because she gets fired from her job, and then she comes home and just, like, hits it hard.
She's like, she takes a job in the secretarial pool, but that's where this fantasy land doesn't make sense, because the people she's renting the house from are real, but then she can't possibly be working as a secretarial typist.
Well, I think that's probably my biggest issue is I almost wish that the end would have been her character waking up in like a psychiatric ward, which is, derivative, but to explain that everything the audience saw was in her mind. But like you said, there are components to what we saw that were real. Like she really was living in that house, although the house probably didn't look like how we saw it. And she was going to the school. It's just she didn't have a son really in school. But then, yeah, like her job, like, did she have a job? It seems like her character wouldn't have a job, but I would have to think that she did. It's just that to the audience, we saw her thinking she worked as a secretary, like a typist. But then what job could she have where she would behave that way? Yeah.
And wearing 50s regalia, using lingo that's like, when she tells her boss off, because she's been drinking on the job, and there's this very specific form that it's a plot point that she keeps messing up, and she's like, I'm gone, daddy-o. To me, it's one of those lazy screenwriting techniques where it's like, well, the protagonist, it's revealed, is crazy, so nothing has to add up or make sense. And I don't think that that's always true. And notably, this was written by a woman named Carol Chrest, who has only written one previous screenplay, and that was 22 years ago in a film called The Prophet's Game, starring Dennis Hopper.
We see early on Laura cutting up a sandwich for Cody. You have never seen someone cut a sandwich like this. It's like a bologna and cheese sandwich, and it's on white Wonder bread. And she's cutting the crust off. But she's cutting the crust off like an inch into the sandwich.
She's cutting a lot of the crust
So
off.
then all you have left is like the middle, like a really tiny middle part. And then I just thought, she is wasting so much
Well,
of that
because I was like, who's eating all that crust then? Because there's like meats and cheeses in that crust.
Yeah, because she cuts so much into it that there's like meats and cheeses in. That really bothered me.
Yeah, well, same, because I commented on that too.
A scene that you mentioned that I think was effective because it did bother me is this idea that like during this period, like in the 1950s, a woman didn't really have privacy, like medical health privacy.
Mm-hmm.
Like if she called the doctor, like she calls the doctor and he's like, well, where's your husband? And like,
Where are you?
Where are you?
And I will tell him. Yeah.
Right. Like, damn. So there are components that do work.
Yeah, like it fits in the anxiety of that. It just doesn't really make sense how we get there. And I had to go back and rewatch the scene because it's like, but why the 1950s? There's one flashback scene where Laura goes back into her mind under this blanket to when she was crying as a child and she had this old book where there's a love spell in it and clearly she'd just been broken up with as like a teenager and her grandma comes up and comforts her and says, God, it must be so hard to date now as a young girl. I wish I could take you back with me to my time when it was so much easier. You'd fit in real well there.
I think that was ineffective because we both were actively watching this, paying attention that scene, and we were both confused.
Well, yeah, because then the reveals later.
Because then when the reveal happens, then it makes sense. But yeah, I think the way it's constructed, it just seems so random.
That's such a slippery slope, and it's so distracting. That scene is so poorly acted that also is distracting.
Well, speaking of poor acting, Colleen Camp is in this.
Oh my God.
She's the landlord.
Wife.
Like the landlord's wife. And the landlord is this very nice, generous gentleman. Like he's being very kind to Christina Ricci's character because she's having a lot of difficulties. Like things are breaking and she seems stressed out and he's like, don't worry, dear, I'll take care of it. But the wife, Colleen Camp's character, is like, no. You come in here dressed with that skirt, you think you're gonna take my husband, don't you help her, she has to pay for this. Her acting is so wooden.
It is bad, and I don't know why. She's all of a sudden in a bunch of stuff, because she's in Father Stew, which she produced, and she is in 9 Bullets. You probably know, her most effective moment ever was probably as, I think she's Sharon Stone's assistant in Sliver.
Well, there's a scene with Christina Ricci and her landlords where she's trying to she thinks that there's like a ghost in the house, but she doesn't want to seem crazy, so she's asking them has anyone ever complained about the house? It's kind of a frustrating scene because it's like, lady, spit the shit out. And then Colleen Camp's character is like, are you on drugs? Like, what are you talking about?
I won't tolerate that in my house.
And then Christina Ricci says, I think I have a demon or something.
No, she's on the phone and she's calling. She's like, yeah, and says it so nonchalantly.
I think I have a demon or something. Like, okay.
Really?
Oh, another moment that I thought was effective is Cody, the little boy, is having problems adjusting, and his mom says, let's throw you a birthday party. So she writes up all these invitations, tells him, go take these at school, pass them out. Then we see her set up for this party. And it's a nice setup. And then there's no one there, and we're waiting. And she's like, you know what, I have your class list, let me call, and maybe the parents are on their way. And then she comes out and says, you know what, I don't think anyone's coming. And the boy's kind of sad, and he's like, it's okay, I'll go up to my room. And then a little later on, we see that all those invitations she gave his
attaché,
which he had an attaché, were still in there. And she goes off on him. Mm-hmm. I thought that was good because I was so angry for her.
It was good, but then after the reveals, it robs kind of the sentiment looking back on any of that.
Well, I'm just confused that if I were creating an alternate reality, why would I make it so awful?
Well,
but I guess if I were emotionally disturbed, then I wouldn't, I don't know. It just, once the reveal happens, it just seems like a lot of this doesn't quite make sense to me.
Yeah, and also that scene was Screaming Stella, starring Bette Midler, with her daughter's birthday party, which of course is a remake of Stella Dallas with Barbara Stanwyck. But
there's something else that happens 4 times, is that we see that Christina Ricci's character has a pain in her side. Mm-hmm. What was that supposed to represent?
God, I don't remember. I think there is.
She does it 4 times.
Yes.
And then she sees things kind of. Oh, now it's hitting me. Every time she had that pain, it was right after her vision would get blurry. Mm-hmm. But I don't think it was meant to be blurry. I think it was meant to be she's underwater.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because
because her son died.
He had drowned the year prior, and she keeps having these manifestations where she's plunged into the water like in the middle of a living room.
It felt very random because until we know that her son's dead, it's like, why is she seeing, like, it's connected to this monster in the water.
That's grandma.
But it's really grandma, but then the boy's saying it's a pretty lady, but it looks like a skeleton.
And he's drawing pictures of her like she's a monster.
But then he's drawing pictures of her like she's a monster, and then she's having these, as the audience, we're seeing these random visions of her being plunged into water, but then we also see her getting blurred vision with pain in her side. It's just a lot.
It does it. I liked how in the 50s, you know, I come to find like the 50s fantasy version, everything is kind of fuzzy and out of focus with the lighting and everything. It looks like something that might have been shot then. I was laughing to myself because the name of the cinematographer is Senda Bonnet.
Oh.
As in Senda Bonnet to Elizabeth Moss.
Oh. My last note was, so, you know, already it's the end of the film when we realized, like, it's not the 1950s, it's modern time. So it's like, oh, wow, and your son is dead. And then when we realized the reason because, you know, I think the scene with her grandma and the little note about being heartbroken that you mentioned, because that didn't register, then we get her in her grandma's car with like a little photo. And I just thought that was such a lazy...
Well, that Colleen Camp finds, like, that is the reveal to us.
That's
like,
the reveal to us.
And it says, like, Grandma's new car, 1959.
I just thought that was so lazy.
I like how they were trying to conjure this 50... Because she's watching television late at night, and there's this creature from the Black Lagoon thing. And you're getting the sense that they're making allusions to that text.
Christina Ricci's character also throughout the film keeps reciting like these old these old timey commercial like this dialogue from old timey commercials, and then once we realized like once I ended the movie, I realized, oh, she's probably reciting like things she heard when she was a kid with her grandma. Mm-hmm. Like maybe the grandma used to play old tapes of something,
and it's a calming mechanism.
But as you're watching it, when you don't know, it just seems so random and crazy. It's just too many random crazy things
that don't...
But I'm like, is there a monster in the water? Or is this bitch just like what is happening?
There's not. Her name and the period piece of it and this notion of being fascinated with someone that's actually dead was, of course, reminding me of Preminger's Laura, a much better film. I will say this is better than I Know Who Killed Me, which I tried to get you to watch several years ago, and you couldn't even finish that. I liked the soundtrack selection. I don't know if they're in the public domain, but Mr. Sandman, which of course is used effectively in Halloween 2, or Buddy Holly. I like all those things. They're effective. But there's just a cheapness to it that you can't get around, as well as the title not really making sense to me. There's a scene where she's in her off-the-rails phase, and she goes to a bar looking for company,
a little
sympathy. She tried to find a friend. And she dances with this man in questionable lighting. And that's Nick Vallelonga, who wrote Green Book.
Oh. Yeah, I think the look of the film, immediately I felt kind of like unsettled, like, oh, this is going to be a little janky. Mm-hmm. So I think it lived up to my expectations.
That said, yeah, I do think Christina Ricci does a fine job because she's kind of funny. You're able to kind of empathize with her immediately in a lot of ways that I don't know a lot of people would have been able to conjure in something that's so poorly written.
I think it's worth the watch for Christina Ricci. I think it might actually be better knowing the gag so that a person could sort of view it through that lens and pick up on the little things. And maybe because I was so confused and so overwhelmed with all the random things, that if a person already knows this is all in her head, it's not really the 1950s and that boy is dead, then maybe you can enjoy it better. But I don't know. What would you give it?
I think 2. I think this person has grown as a filmmaker, but maybe not as a storyteller. I'm really tired of this the kid or the person's really dead twist. It's been done before. I don't know why that is such a fascination anymore, especially if it's not really well executed. But 2, I think, is fair.
I would give it 2 as well. Anything else?
No.
Listen to our podcast. Bye.